Okay, to look at some CSS hacks and solutions. There recently became a native CSS aspect ratio, which solves a problem which has always been kind of worked around in the past. So if you've got a grid of products and you need them all to be the same height, but the images are all different, you can't really just put a fixed height and width because you'll skew all the images and squish them. So a solution someone found is you work out the height and width you want, you set your width to that pixels, and then you work out the relative percentage for that ratio. You set the image to be a background image, and then you add like padding top to that percentage. You can just sort of skew the images so that they all display in the right way. I kind of remember really liking that. That was like my favorite hack, the idea that like you'd found a way of doing something that wasn't possible in CSS, just sort of popping something up to work in a certain way that looked like it did an effect. Now the tool has come in, so that's good. There's a kind of sadness that like that hack is no longer valuable, but it's quite nice that there's a solution. Just maybe think about these situations in CSS where we're always trying to push the boundaries and go further and do things that are not yet possible, but to sort of find solutions anyway, even though we can't do it. That's kind of one of the appealing things about CSS when I started. I remember the Leveroo doing these CSS Secrets, these videos that were like gold dust, these amazing like, did you know you could do this, you could do this, and they were always kind of these nifty ways of, there's this tool, and if you manage to do it this way, or if you add this value, it will make it look like you're doing this, or do this. And people have found all these kind of nifty ways to do visual effects, or to be able to play with underlines or wavy text, or making things animate in a certain way. And it was always kind of about, you kind of have to play with the properties or skew something to make it work in a certain way. But I remember always just being really amazed by this. It was really inspiring to think like, yeah, the limit really is your own imagination about how far you can push things, or how you can find a way of presenting something or making a workaround. The thing is though, as time goes on, as you learn more in programming, you're generally taught that's bad. The idea is like that's a hack solution. The word hack is bad. People criticize something going, that's good, but it's a bit hacky. The idea that like, this is all a kind of a bad thing because it's not scalable, or it might not work in another context, or over time this might get out of sync, or it won't display properly, or people might be able to find more bugs because you're not using something as intended. You know, in I know, more of a programming language, the idea of sort of saying, this doesn't really do what you want, but you can sort of pretend it does. It doesn't cut it, and that would be largely criticized like, no, that's not the solution. We should use these tools exactly as they're given to us. CSS doesn't really fall in those lines. People like the fact that it can't do things, but you're always trying to do visual things with code. So you're always trying to go, well, we could use this to sort of skew it to look different. It sort of operates in its own system by its own rules. I mean, think about JavaScript. Didn't have types at all until someone made a sort of TypeScript variant to go to JavaScript. Didn't have mutable data, so now people have made like mutable libraries that will represent something like that. There's now an object freeze property. Didn't have native classes for the longest time, even though people were building these big class components. That sort of latterly came in. People always kind of wanted things, and they've had to make kind of workarounds, but very quickly then solved that problem and built something into to give people what they originally wanted. With CSS, it seems that it doesn't fall into the same categories. People kind of are quite happy to work within its limitations, or keep trying to push it or represent things, because you're trying to solve visual problems. You're trying to use code to make things that you look at. So you're always trying to sort of work around the parameters to sort of somewhat string together something visually. But it's sort of its own beast in that way. It doesn't operate in the same rules of most programming languages. Now I wonder if the tide is turning on that one. Obviously there's so much development going on in CSS. We're bringing in so many tools that we've been asking for a long time. The grid and flexbox means you solve all kinds of layout hacks you used to have to do. Or this year, container queries, which has forever been the most talked about thing, is coming through. People are getting nesting. That means you can move away from Sass. It seems that we're starting to really mature this language, and so this sort of having to make do with some sort of hacky solution seems less and less appealing. There's a recent course on front-end masters with Leveroo now talking about CSS variables, which are also an incredibly powerful tool, a modern feature, something that does solve a lot of problems. And in the middle of that course, after talking about all these ways you can build incredibly sophisticated code that scales well and gives you all kinds of values you can live interpolate, starts talking about a white space hack. This idea of if you give white space, it gets confused, but it can't fall back to the default because at runtime it won't have a value, so it will just go back to something else. And it was a way you can sort of create a toggle. You can switch between two things by updating it to a white space so it can fall back to a sub value. It's a real hacky solution. And it's incredible that somebody who I grew up watching a lot of those videos of like CSS Secrets, basically a list of hacks and ways of working around. In the middle of that course, looking at some modern sophisticated feature, suddenly kind of went, oh, another hack. I don't really like that. It suggested I was starting to feel that CSS was moving away from hacks, and we're kind of maturing now, and we don't really want to find those solutions. It's interesting that maybe my perspective has changed over time, that the hacks have been like what made CSS fun to something like, oh, no, we don't want that anymore. We're grown up. You know, I think about Grid. Before Grid came along, you'd have to just make a bunch of divs and float them and give them percentages, and they would just sort of hang together. Like they weren't really aware of one another. They were just some boxes. There was no relative system, and they did quite often break and they just push onto new lines. It was quite messy. And going further back than that, people found that spacing was inconsistent between browsers, so you'd have to make an image that was like a pixel wide and then like stretch that image's width to sort of like a transparent image to just sort of give even spacing between things. People have always just found workarounds, and it just seemed like maybe we're getting past that now. If we want something, there's the tools out there to just get it, you know. But then CSS really isn't like anything else. It's not quite a programming language, but it's not really markup. It does have logic to it. It's a visual test. Even if your code like passes all its checks, the actual test is how it looks. It has so many different contexts. You can't just give it an input and expect an output. You have to try and run it through browsers and screen widths and different feature flags, or different things being switched on and off, and different CPUs in environments, or different assets being loaded at different states. It's such a configurable, confusing thing, and has so many quirks around how it renders and displays things. CSS developers are always trying to solve visual problems that can't easily be just run through some sort of unit test to show this feature delivers X. You're sort of part architect trying to build structural code that's really logical, that can scale over time. Then you're also sort of part magician. You're trying to sort of show people glitter with one hand while, you know, animating something in the background with the other. You're trying to fade something onto a dark background so the user doesn't see a box moving out of direction, or you're trying to do something a bit quirky using the properties that you have at hand. So, you know, to see text that looks like it's being drawn in an animation, but it's actually to do with the stroke width being extended. That's a kind of a hack, but it's a beautiful way of extending something to give an effect. The ability to create a 3D box, which is actually just skewed perspective divs, or to build that cannon that will shoot things, and you can actually use properties to control the trajectory and move it. The ability to build games and all kinds of complex things. In the background, it really is all just a bunch of bits of sellotape sticking the thing together. It's all kind of hacky, but it's kind of what makes CSS quite beautiful. It's kind of what makes it so innovative and so interesting, and probably appealing to people getting into coding. And I guess that's it. The innovators of CSS have always used hacks. They've always tried to push things beyond what's capable, and that often demonstrates what CSS could be, but also prompts the developers of the features to say, look, these are the tools we're lacking, these are the things we need, and that obviously spurs the conversation to move things forward. Think about how much jQuery has moved forward JavaScript by demonstrating a lot of shorthand tools that people would really want, or TypeScript is now pushing JavaScript to maybe start having some sort of type interpolation involved. There's generally, you have to go out and kind of demonstrate a need or a use case, and I guess part of that is the hack. You have to show that, look, this thing is really useful if only it were native, and that can then move things forward. So it's considered a nasty term in many contexts, but the hack is probably intrinsic to making CSS successful. And right now we're in kind of the most exciting, most abundant phase for CSS, and there's just so many incredible features coming through in recent years, and this year in particular. I think we owe a lot of it to the hacks. Okay, let's have a look at Assembler CSS. It's been knocking around for a little while. I got a chance to really read through and play with it. So it's a kind of version of utility CSS framework. But instead of the Tailwind idea that you import a bunch of classes to reuse, you sort of just plug in your CSS and it does the work for you. So the idea is, yeah, there's no real big software to install. You attach a little script and it'll kind of let you do some work. Let's have a look, right? So the first thing we do, we attach a script to the top of the page. Let's grab this one. We'll drop it into a pen. And then the idea is that if you traditionally wrote an inline piece of CSS like this, background, width, height, instead you write an X style, like a custom attribute here. And what the tool does is then extracts those values. We put this in here. And makes the CSS for you. So if we now inspect this, you can see the X style we added, but then it's made this bunch of random classes. And then in the style tag has then set what some of the attributes of those are. If we look up here, you see there's a specialist class here which is going to set that background color, a border radius, a height, margin. So it kind of looks a bit finicky and confusing. But if I go down here and build another div, or let's build an input, and we're gonna go X style, and I'm gonna use the same background here as we used in our div. Okay, what it's done is applied the same class, the Assembler CSS, as used up here. So rather than setting a background purple in two places, it's made that one class which just refers to that one variable, and it's been able to work out for you that you can reuse that one property there. And obviously if you think over time, if you're just going to make hundreds and hundreds of width and height settings that might be very similar, font settings that might be similar, certainly color settings that are going to be similar, rather than bloating your CSS by redeclaring the same values thousands of times, it's going to do the work for you of just working out where there are crossovers and similarities of the same properties and massively reducing them down to a series of utility classes. It's kind of interesting if you think about the problem with Tailwind, at least I often thought, was that you have to install this big library, there's a big setup, you have to then run through your config and your variables and your things, install post CSS, configure it, then configure your library that's going to shrink the CSS and take out the unneeded things. You've also then got to live in the documentation. You've got to spend a lot of time referring to all the classes and learning all the shorthand class names for simple things like font bold and, I don't know, margin top. You're going to have to keep learning what all the shorthands are and what their values are, and you're going to have to keep going back and adjusting those as you see fit, adding a special, if you had a new color in your system, you're going to have to add that as a setting somewhere and then be able to refer back to it. So there's a kind of a big initial learning curve to sort of getting it up and running. Eventually you'll probably be a lot more productive, but there's that blocker. Here you really just start writing some native CSS and the work is being done for you to kind of simplify your CSS. You're going to get smaller CSS bundles and optimize loading quite quickly. The problem is this firstly looks quite messy. You have kind of, you're going to have HTML files that are massive because you get these big long inline blocks. You're just moving away from using CSS files altogether. There's a partial solution. If we look at mix-ins, the idea that you can create a group of settings. So here we've got like background color, background image, or here you might make like box mix-in, which has the width, the height, and the margin, the radius. And then here you've got one for color. And then you can just apply these as styles. You're sort of saying find this mix-in and this mix-in. So you could group common settings together, and that would make your HTML not look as messy, and it would mean you kind of could group up some of the styles. Still a little bit clunky, that. It seems like a bit of a workaround. I guess you would still do some configuration, and that's quite nice that the code is documentation. You'd list out what all your color settings are, you'd list out what all your sizes are, and that would help you then make classes to refer back to those. That's quite Tailwind like. I guess there are probably ways of making this very maintainable over time. It's yeah, I really like the amount of low-level setup, that whether you're doing it for some quick hacky thing or you're doing it for some big project, you really can just plug it in and start working, and you don't have to think too much about your CSS settings. I just wonder over time how much there's no relation between the HTML elements. So, and you need a very reliable design system or very reliable set of configurations so that you know you can make big changes and not break things. In a big CSS system, like in traditional system where you have like a massive CSS file that's got hundreds of settings, you can go back and change that class and know that you've fixed all the places that class is being used. Whereas here you've got that kind of very tight scoping because of the place where you set the height is just the place where you set the height in 100 places. I wonder how much you've got to make sure everyone is always adhering to those settings to be able to make those changes. As always with these things, it solves some problems, and it ultimately comes down to how well the team adopts and operates within it. But it's a really interesting way of going, and I'd be really curious to try this on a future project to just see what pains we solve. Be quite cool. It's a shame though no one likes writing CSS files anymore. Everyone's kind of got to find a workaround to avoid it. Interesting one to keep in mind though, might really suit particular projects you're doing.